Salvete amici. I am Magister Kyer, and I am here to introduce a video in a series of debates that I have been undertaking with one Mr. Hugh Owen, who is the head of the Colby Center, a Catholic young Earth or traditional age creationist research center, and with some of the guests that he has graciously brought along, who have expertise in various topics and have been eager to join in some of these debates. Uh, as of the date of this recording, this is going to be the first video that I've uploaded. It turns out that the process of taking debates, trimming them with, trimming them to make them more manageable. I would like to add the time codes, and then, especially for the first two debates, I wasn't as consistent with providing sources that could be easily seen and easily referenced to. So I'm going to be providing sources with time codes, and that whole process just takes quite a bit of time. So this video is going to have to come out before those have been officially posted on my channel, and this is therefore going to make probably very little sense to those of you who are coming into the channel with only this video on it. But this is going to be a specific response. So we have finished 4 of these debates. We have 6 more that have been planned and scheduled. But in the process of completing these 4 debates, a few questions came up that Mr. Hugh Owen wants addressed. And despite my protestations that these are neither my area of expertise nor areas that I am actually interested in talking about, he insisted that if I don't answer these 4 questions, he will not proceed with the rest of the debate. And so, trying to make these questions as painless as possible for me, while still maintaining some modicum of sanity. I have no interest in debating any of these 4. I have no interest in talking about them at all, but I decided I would make a single video that covers all 4 of them, and then move on with my life. As I understand it, Hugh Owen is also planning to make a video responding to, or potentially a series of videos responding to these questions, or specifically to my answers of the questions, which he's welcome to do. I may or may not respond to his responses. I was disinclined to acquiesce his request in the first place, and so whether or not I find myself more inclined to respond to his response depends in large part off of how well he characterizes me and my points, and much less on the actual topic at hand. But with that introduction out of the way, what is the topic at hand? One other thing before I forget, for anyone who is interested, I will be having a debate with Dan Florick, who runs a Catholic young adults group in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and that will be recorded tomorrow. And the normal debate schedule should resume in a few weeks with a question of whether or not the God of the Old Testament is just, which is a topic I find particularly near and dear to my heart, and particularly important for us to discuss. Now, without further ado, Code, Life, and Mutations, a response to Hugh Owen. So first of all, these are the 4 questions that Hugh presented to me. The first is, does code come from chemicals through material processes? The second is, can life come from non-life? The third is, can completely new, functional, biological information come about through genetic mutations? And the fourth is genetic entropy and its chronological implications valid? I left out the chronological implications because if genetic entropy is not valid, then its chronological implications are not either, and this looks a little nicer in my slideshow. Now, to address these questions, first of all, I want to address my methodology, right? Because this actually has come up a few times in our debates and our discussions, and I feel is important. And frankly, this seems as good a time as any to discuss, right? So, when addressing any of these topics that I have been debating, I have a methodology. And this methodology is, as far as I'm aware, consistent regardless of the topic, and just as full of scrutiny whether I initially agree with the stance I'm trying to defend or the stance that I'm researching or not. But first, worldview. Right, so in trying to address methodology, the first question here that I have seen already come up in these debates is, does worldview matter? There was a moment fairly early on in which Hugh asserted that there is a very clear difference between somebody with an atheistic worldview and a biblical worldview, right? So the idea he conveyed was that if we look at the data properly through the proper worldview, we cannot help but agree with the Bible. Uh, and similarly, if we don't come to biblical conclusions, then we must reconsider whether or not we came to the data with the proper worldview. So my main issue with this is its circular nature, right? How can we prove whether or not Christianity is true? Well, obviously, you have to approach the data from a Christian perspective. And oh my goodness, when you approach the data from a Christian perspective, suddenly Christianity is proven. It must be true. That is, of course, once you filter out any of the data that you disagree with, any of the data that is problematic. As we've seen in a few of the debates, the data here is kind of a flexible thing. The evidence is a flexible thing. But even what evidence should or should not be submitted must be considered through a Christian worldview. And then comes the accusation that I am merely looking at this through an atheistic worldview. Obviously, I can't understand the Bible. Obviously, I can't agree with the Bible. My whole worldview is atheistic. So, I briefly want to address methodological versus philosophical naturalism, because that's a bit of what's going on here. All right, so, and you'll have to pardon me, it's allergy season. My throat's been a little bit ticklish. Excuse me. But when discussing worldview, one of the things we must discuss is our approach to data, especially in this case to the science. Right? So what is naturalism? Well, naturalism is the belief that all that there is nature, right? It is the belief that we do not have miracles, there is no supernatural, all we have is nature. The problem is that there is a difference between methodological naturalism and philosophical naturalism. So philosophical naturalism is a specific worldview. It is a view on the nature of the world, in which all that there is nature and nothing supernatural, right? So just automatically refusing to believe anything that is contrary to this. And this is what I hear a lot of young Earth or traditional age creationists accuse scientists of, is having this philosophical naturalism. Obviously, they are just approaching the data presupposing that miracles cannot be true. This is different from methodological naturalism. Methodological naturalism is saying, since a miracle is out of the ordinary, since the supernatural is out of the ordinary, unless we find specific evidence for it or have a way to test it and verify it, we are going to have to just assume, for the sake of research that what we are looking at has natural, not supernatural causes. A scientist cannot go and look at, say, the process of birth in mammals and say, oh, this is clearly just a miracle. If that were the case, we would get nowhere, right? So they say, okay, maybe there's a supernatural element that depends on the individual scientist's worldview, and a lot of scientists, even now, are indeed faith uh, faith-holding scientists, theistic scientists. But when we look at a birth, we must say, okay, let's see what is going on here. What naturally is happening? And if at the end of that process we cannot determine what is happening naturally, we can say, all right, then there is room for disagreement here. There is a lack of understanding. We don't know. And if it's something we don't know and don't have evidence to suggest one possibility over the other, then there seems to be quite a bit more room for something like a philosophical or theological interpretation. But we begin, for the sake of science, by saying we are going to examine and explore that which can be tested, observed, reproduced, studied. And only if after that we find that there is nothing there that fits into those categories are we going to start talking about the supernatural. Now, with that in mind, I have on here as well how to overcome bias. This is a very important point. When we approach any subject, the wisest, the most productive approach is always going to be to lay aside whatever we think we know about the subject, whatever specific worldview we have on the subject, and to examine the evidence for the subject. If we are approaching, say, the shape of the earth, we could walk into that conversation with a certain set of preconceived ideas that then influence what research we do and what results we accept. However, doing so will not help us to find the truth. It will only help us to reinforce our desired stance. What we ought to do is walk into the question of the shape of the earth, asking ourselves, what are the arguments and what is the evidence? If we have some people saying the earth is flat, we have others saying that the earth is round, whence comes those claims? Do we have any evidence that supports one over the other? And then after looking at the evidence available, then we can make our judgment. But if we make our judgment before we have looked at the data, then we are engaging in circular reasoning of a sort, and in begging the question. We are engaged in problematic logic. If we are approaching the question of, is the Bible true, for instance, and we have presupposed the Bible being true, we can never actually answer whether the Bible is true. Because, well, to answer that question, we have presupposed it. We have begged the question. And so the conversation ends up being fruitless, other than reinforcing our own dogmas, our own biases. A question I ask a friend of mine often that relates to this is the question of, if everything about our worldview was wrong, how would you know? Right? We have thousands of religions, and most of those are contradictory with the others. They cannot all be true. but the people who believe in them sincerely. They believe in them fiercely. And so, in questioning, how can I know mine is true and theirs are not? We must begin from a point of saying, I don't know. Let's find out. If you begin from the point, I already know, I know my faith tradition is the correct one, and then you go and look for evidence, what you're really looking for is evidence to confirm your pre-existing bias and to disprove others' assertions. That is not good science. So, as I progress through the rest of these talking points, and as we progress through the rest of the debate, these are topics to keep in mind. Number 2, sources, sources, sources. How do we find good sources? And how do we tell if they're good sources? I was listening to a statistic recently that was horrifying. It turns out that students who are homeschooled especially, but recently students in particular school systems are particularly bad at being able to tell if a source is a good source or not. Number 1, if a source is not peer-reviewed, question it. Big question marks, right? Because what that says is that the person who published it did not necessarily go through any kind of rigorous review process to ensure that he is right. I can say anything I want and post it onto a blog. Scientists can say anything he wants and post it onto Twitter. That does not make it true. And one of the ways that we can check to see if it's true is by getting other experts in the field to examine his methodology, to examine his study, and to try and poke holes in it. And only after no holes can be poked do you publish it. That is the peer review process. Now, there can be some sources that are not peer-reviewed that are good, but generally they are going to be ones that are pointing to studies, and that when you go and you read the study, you find agree with or are not misrepresenting the study. So, how do we find good sources? Well, we are primarily talking about history and science. Peer-reviewed is a fantastic place to start. Second, we must make sure that when things are peer-reviewed, they are peer-reviewed in an honest manner. Recently, there was a publication of a curse tablet found on Mount Elba that was proposed to be the earliest example of Hebrew writing, dating all the way back to the supposed time of Joshua. It was then published for peer review in a metalworking academic journal that had little to do with archaeology and nothing to do with epigraphy. Should that be taken seriously? Well, no. No, not really. Right? The peer reviewers in that case are not experts on what has been submitted and thus should be questioned. It should be questionable. So, we must not simply find good peer-reviewed sources, but we also must ensure that the people doing the peer review are themselves not problematic. Now, extending this idea of worldview, I want to address a very specific question, because this was brought up in conjunction with the 4 questions that are being asked. Hugh Owen indicated that I have to answer these 4 questions, because if I don't answer these 4 questions, my belief system has nothing to stand on. So, I want to address that briefly so that there is no confusion and no misconceptions. What is atheism? I myself grew up Protestant, converted to Catholicism, but I am now an atheist. What does that mean? Well, there is a common misconception that that atheists believe that there is no God. That's false. That is a positive claim. That is saying I actively believe that there is no God. Rather, atheism is a passive claim. It is saying that the claim here is that there is a God, and I am not convinced of that claim. So it is not that I actively believe that there is no God, but rather that I passively just lack a belief in God. I passively am just not convinced based off of generally the evidence or whatever criteria somebody is an atheist for. Also, atheism is only about whether or not there is a God. That is the only question atheism is concerned with. You can be an atheist and believe any number of things. You can be an atheist and still believe in the supernatural. You can be an atheist and believe in random cosmic forces. You can be an atheist and believe and be a skeptic, like I am. Atheism is simply a statement that we just lack a belief in a God. That's it. Nothing about how life is formed, nothing about how the universe is formed, right? You can believe anything you want about the origins of life, and as long as you don't have a belief in a God, you are an atheist. Similarly, there are many Christians who also believe in the Big Bang Theory, in evolutionary science, right? In fact, the majority of Christians accept the very clear science on these topics. You can be a Christian and not hold to a literal interpretation of Genesis, not hold to the young earth traditional age framework. And you can be an atheist and believe whatever the heck you want about any of those four questions. So, with those out of the way, let's define a few terms. First of all, what is a scientific theory? So this gets thrown around quite a bit. The idea that, well, evolution is just a scientific theory. A scientific theory is not a scientific law. It's not a scientific fact. The problem is that a scientific theory is the highest level of criteria you can reach in science. Science is not interested in proofs, right? My second point here, what does it mean to prove something in scientific discussions? If you are in a discussion about science and somebody says they will prove something scientific to you, they're using that word in the colloquial, right? They're using that in the basic everyman's definition of prove, and that is that I can demonstrate this to definitely be true. Science is not about proving. That is a mathematical concept. Science is demonstrating, and a scientific theory is the best hypothesis using all of the available data. A scientific theory never becomes a scientific law, just like the theory of gravity is a different thing from the law of gravity. Germ theory is still a theory. You don't prove these things, not in a scientific sense, right? Proofs are mathematical, not used in science. So, when we say that evolution is a scientific theory, what we are saying is evolution is the hypothesis that best covers all of the available data, and specifically, evolution is the most well-attested scientific theory. As far as the science is concerned, germ theory, the theory of gravity, the theory of relativity, all of these are much more likely to be entirely false than the theory of evolution. And then the term fitness is going to come up a few times, especially in the third and fourth questions here. For something to be fit, it is simply survivable in its environment and able to reproduce. My favorite example of this is if I take a lion and a chihuahua, and I put them both into the deserts of Africa. The lion is going to eat the chihuahua. However, if I put the lion and the chihuahua into the streets of Los Angeles. All of the Los Angeles, California white girls are going to scream and squeal and rush to save the Chihuahua from the evil lion, which is going to be promptly shot by the LAPD. The lion is the fittest of the two in the savannas of Africa. It is not the fittest in the streets of Los Angeles. Thus, while the lion will have no chance to reproduce in Los Angeles, we have a plethora of Chihuahuas there, right? So fitness is simply about being able to survive in your environment to reproduce. That's it. If something is fit in one environment, it is likely not fit in other environments. And changes to fitness in one environment may make it more suited for a new environment, even while making it less suited for another. And we will discuss this slightly more when we get to the mutations. All right, prologue out of the way. Question 1. Can genetic code come from chemicals through material processes? Yes. Cool. All right, question number 2. No. I have more information here than that, right? First, we have to ask ourselves, well, what does this mean, code, right? This is how the question was presented. Specifically, the question was presented as, can code arise? What does code mean? Well, specifically by code, he means genetic code, right? So, according to the National Human Genome Research Institute, specifically from the Glossary of Genomic and Genetic Terms, which is cited here, genetic code refers to the instructions contained in a gene that tell a cell how to make a specific protein. Each gene's code uses the 4 nucleotide bases of DNA. I'm not even going to try to pronounce those, but we have A, C, G, and T. In various ways to spell out 3-letter codons that specify which amino acid is needed at each position within a protein. Oftentimes, when I'm listening to young Earth creationists, traditional age creationists, when I'm listening to these people talking about code, they like to use terminology that allows them to convey agency when agency need not be conveyed. Right? So if there is a code, there must be a code writer. If there is a creation, there must be a creator, those sorts of things, where the language used presupposes the conclusion. This code is not written as, say, computer code, in which we can see a clear, human agency. Although, even computer code has gotten to the point where it can write itself, thus not even necessitating human intervention by itself. But no, code is just simply when X, Y, and Z happens, or A, C, G, and T happens, in a particular order, particular things occur. That's all it is. When certain chemicals are in a particular order, specifically when the nucleotide bases of DNA are in specific orders, they do specific things. That's all that code here is, genetic code. So, what do we see in the scholarship, right? I don't like these topics. So I'm not interested in giving a thorough, exhaustive breakdown. I am going to exclusively refer to the scholarship on the subject because that is where I'm going to get my own information on the subject. And because the scholarship for all 4 of these questions is quite robust. Right, so what does scholarship say on this question? Well, number 1, we have here the general features of the genetic code are described. It is considered that originally only a few amino acids were coded, but that most of the possible codons were fairly soon brought into use. In subsequent steps, additional amino acids were substituted when they were able to confer a selective advantage, until eventually the code became frozen in its present form. By the way, this is from 1968. We have had viable theories on the origin of genetic code since the 1960s. Also, by the way, there is, from what my research revealed, there is still an ongoing debate about it being frozen in its present form, and it actually seems as if it's not frozen, and it is still in the process of evolving. But again, this is from 1968. Uh, Moving to 1970, it seems therefore probable that the genetic code originated in an evolutionary replacement of a part of an amino acid absorption site by the linked codon sequence of mRNA. 2005, even more recent, there is significant evidence that cognate codons and or anticodons are unexpectedly frequent in RNA binding sites for 7 of 8 biological amino acids that have been tested. This suggests that a substantial fraction of the genetic code has a stereochemical basis, the triplets having escaped from their original function in amino acid binding sites to become modern codons and anticodons. We explicitly show this stereochemical basis is consistent with subsequent optimization of the code to minimize the effect of coding mistakes on protein structure. These data also strengthen the argument for invention of the genetic code in an RNA world and for the RNA world itself. The RNA world, as we will discuss in a later question, is one of the models for the origin of life. This paper by Yaris et al. Citations for all of this information will be coming up. This paper is going over and discussing how the origin of genetic code has significant evidence. Not just does the origin have significant evidence, but it coincides with the other theories that we have regarding, or other hypotheses. I will be careful with my language there. Other hypotheses that we have about the origins of life. It turns out that these two fields seem to work together in this. We have plenty of evidence for the origin of genetic code from chemicals. That was in 2005. Something a little more recent, 2008. The three main concepts on the origin and evolution of the code are the stereochemical theory, according to which codon assignments are dictated by physiochemical affinity between amino acids and the cognate codons, etc. The parts to this I really want to draw your attention to, since this is a fairly long quote. These theories are not mutually exclusive. Which theories? The theories for the evolution origin of genetic code. They are not mutually exclusive, and are also compatible with the frozen accent hypothesis. That is, the notion that the standard code might have no special properties, but was fixed simply because all extant life forms share a common ancestor with subsequent changes to the code, mostly precluded by the deleterious effect of codon reassignment. So this gets into very specifically that, hey, all of these theories could be true, and, it's also very possible that the reason genetic code is the way that it is simply because it originated in the same common ancestor. And if there were a common ancestor for other life forms, maybe this would be different than it is. But with all extant life forms sharing a common ancestor, subsequent changes to the code, precluded by the deleterious effects of codon reassignment, explain or can help explain the origin of genetic code. That's 2019. The first genetic code, in other words, was necessarily ambiguous, and its evolution took place with a mechanism that systematically reduced its ambiguity and eventually removed it. The concept of ambiguity reduction has been repeatedly mentioned in the scientific literature. There is a lot of research on the origin of genetic code. This is not my field of expertise, and this is not a subject I actually care all that much about. So I am not the person to thoroughly explain what these different terms are for, how these pieces are working together. But what I can do is I can do the research, I can point to multiple lines of scholarship, and I can say, hey, all of these people, all of these papers deal with origin of life research. Maybe if you're looking for the origins of the uh, biological code, you should go and read the research rather than asking the history major who has explicitly stated he is not interested in this. Question number 2. Can life come from non-life? Well, first the question is, do we know how life began? The answer is no. Unfortunately, none of us were there, and currently, there are too many theories that all have evidence, that all have legitimacy on how life began. There are too many studies for us to be able to safely say, or confidently say, which one of them, if indeed it is only one of them, caused life to begin. See, it could be a combination of multiple of these. We don't know because we weren't there, but what we do know is that there are very clear lines of scientific evidence. There have been very clear experiments that have demonstrated that actually life can begin from non-life, and even if we don't know exactly how it started on our planet, it's only because we have so much data on the topic and so many lines of evidence that we're just not sure which one of them specifically it was. The main theories right now that I was able to find are electricity, molecules on clay, deep sea vents, low temperatures, and the RNA world. If you're interested in knowing how the current scientific literature uh, addresses electricity forming life, I present to you 4 papers, or sorry, 3 papers and an interview. If you're interested in molecule on clay, here are 3 papers. If you're interested in deep sea vent, another 3 papers. Low temperatures, look at that, 3 more papers. RNA world, here's 4 of them. I have provided plenty of resources. Hugh, if you are genuinely curious to know what the science is on how life began, I present to you here plenty of resources to do your own research. And if you are interested only in how I believe life began, I really don't personally care. It's not necessary to my framework for the world. How life began is an interesting question for others to research. And if you are only interested in bringing up this question because you believe it to be a defeater that I can't answer, sure, I can't answer it because I'm not an origins of life researcher. But we have hundreds of those. We have over 1,000 origin of life research. We have teams of origin of life researchers. If you are interested in the origins of life and how life could come from non-life, you can ask one of them, or you can do your research and read the science. And these are only a few of the papers that I could have provided. Right? These are great starting points. But you can take this, and anyone who is interested, you can go and read the research, see how they're coming to these conclusions. There's a lot of interesting information. The really, really short version is that we 100% have been able to see both amino acids, the building blocks to life, be able to assemble on their own, and have been able to recreate situations in which we can easily see how amino acids could then form into a simple single cellular organism and through various mutations, time, reproduction, right? Because single cellular organisms can just reproduce asexually, depending on the organism, right? We can develop from one cell to 2 cells to 4 cells to all of the life that we have today through a very long period of time and individual small changes in populations. Again, for more information, feel free to go and read all of the papers. Third question. Can functional, new, biological information come about through genetic mutations? First of all, what's a mutation? Well, a mutation is a change in the DNA sequence of an organism. Mutations can result from errors in DNA replication during cell division, exposure to mutagens, or a viral infection. Germline mutations that occur in eggs and sperm can be passed on to offspring, while somatic mutations that occur in body cells are not passed on. Notice, by the way, germline mutations can be passed on, but are not necessarily passed on. That's going to be important for question number 4. Yeah, this question is dumb and makes no sense. All mutations are new information. All mutations are new information, right? A mutation is a change to the genetic code, which then is necessarily new information because it is no longer copied and pasted. It is now different. That makes it new. And to that end, not only is it new information, but there are a plethora of examples of that new information being fully functional. People who have an eye color other than brown have a form of genetic mutation. Green eyes and red hair are genetic mutations. The ability to drink milk after you're like 3 is a genetic mutation that is functional. All of them are functional. There is a change to the genetic code. There has been an error in the genetic code being copied over, and that error has produced new information, and that new information is functional. Right? Here are some examples. Here are 3 examples of common mutation types using English words to help illustrate to even the most science illiterate audience member. All right, the first is substitution. This is where the genetic code tries to put one letter in and puts in another. Right? So instead of it being the word mat, it's the word bat. It replaces, it substitutes the letter M with the letter B. Guess what? This is new information. We've changed the word. It's still a functional word. I can still use it in a sentence. Insertion, right? Where a bit of genetic code is just inserted into the wrong place. Mat versus mate. Once again, new information, still fully functional, right? And deletion, right? Mat versus at. Part of the genetic code goes missing. Part of it is deleted. It is not included. Now, there are plenty of mutations that do not create functional code, right? There is, in fact, a huge part of the human genome, in fact, of the genome, the DNA sequence in general, huge part, that can be completely knocked out with no change whatsoever to the organism. This has been experimented on, this has been tried, and this has been done and repeatedly done. And in fact, this is the part of the genetic code, this is the part of DNA that is commonly called junk DNA. It's because we have no clue what the actual function of it is, but we do know if we remove it, nothing seems to change, right? That is an example of the remnants of mutations that have created non-functional genetic changes. However, a mutation, first of all, again, to repeat, a mutation creates new information necessarily. This is such a ludicrous claim, right? If you take a book and you just take a period out of that book, you have changed the information in the book. It is new information. It was an error that has created new information. If Mr. Hugh Owen is specifically asking me whether or not mutations can create entirely new information, like if let's say that DNA is working with, to use this example, right, MAT, B, and E as all letters that it can play with, and suddenly the word flow, which uses none of those letters, pops up. Well, no, DNA doesn't do that. Mutations don't do that. Nobody claims that they do. That is not the claim of evolution. The claim of evolution is that small changes over time to already existing information change change that information in a way that sometimes is beneficial and sometimes is deleterious. And typically, if it is deleterious, it is selected against because, well, it causes issues. If you are born with a mutation, say, that makes you sterile, you're not going to reproduce and have more children. You will just remain sterile. And that then ends that genetic mutation line. You don't get to pass it on to your children because you don't have any. Right? But those small changes over a long period of time, right, slowly evolve from single-celled organism to much more complex creatures, but it's always just using the same information. To continue using the alphabet analogy, this is kind of like saying that the evolution of an alphabet itself, right, from highly complicated cuneiform or hieroglyphs to something that is more simple and streamlined, right, as we select 4 letters that are easy to copy and against ones that are hard to copy. We select 4 writing system that's easy to learn and against a writing system that's hard to learn. And then when we move into the printing press, we see that even then we are simplifying the alphabet by selecting against letters that are complicated or difficult for the printing press and for ones that aren't. Right. That is a form of evolution in which we are taking already existing information and we are shifting it. We are adjusting it, selecting for or against things, changing it as it becomes more fit for its environment. As we move more towards world literacy, we need an alphabet that's easier rather than an alphabet that's more complex, which works much better for a specific highly elite upper class like we saw with the scribes and kings in Egypt. So, yes, mutations are new information, and they do create functional information. Here are just 4 examples that I pulled from a random link to finish addressing the point, right? The first one reduces heart disease, the second one increases bone density, the third one increases malaria resistance, and the fourth one gives tetrachromatic vision. Now, very often when a mutation occurs, it is taking information that should be doing one thing and changing it to do another thing. That's what happens. Code is misrepresented. The genetic code is changed a little, and that creates this break in information. So something that should be doing one thing is now doing another. Sometimes it is still able to do the original thing, sometimes it's not. And so some of these, like malaria resistance, comes about through the sickle cell mutation. Now, the sickle cell mutation is also one that has created sickle cell, asymptomatic sickle cell, where you are carrier but not actively having the disease or passing it on. I believe that's not my area of expertise. I have heard this said, have not verified, right? But yes, in some of these instances, you can have a mutation in which you gain a good thing, but also either a previous good thing no longer works as well, or you gain a bad thing as well, something changes. But that's the thing. If you are in the Arctic and you have a mutation that causes you to grow more hair, you are more fit for your environment in the Arctic. But if I take you to the Sahara and you have a mutation that causes you to grow more hair, you will die of heat exhaustion. Something that is beneficial in one environment is detrimental in another. Fitness is all about having beneficial mutations in the environment that they are in. And sometimes things that are kind of useful end up mutating into something that is really useful, and then that gets passed on because others die, etc. Right? Again, not my area of expertise, but yes, genetic mutations can both create new information and functional information. All right. Last one, is genetic entropy valid? The argument for genetic entropy is that mutations accumulate in the genome. Almost all of them are slightly bad, and eventually everything will die at the same time due to them. The refutation. True, mutations accumulate in the genome, but the statement overall lacks nuance, is demonstrably false, and completely unsubstantiated. By the way, the scientist who developed this is John Sanford. John Sanford has been shown the errors of his theory multiple times, and like most of the creationist scientists that I have seen, completely has refused to acknowledge any of them, completely has refused to change his position, and so ardently holds that he is right and must be right, despite evidence to the contrary. Right? Okay. So, no effect on. So, there are 3 types of mutations. Some mutations have no effect or a neutral effect, and I am running out of time, so I'm going to speed through these a little. Some have a detrimental effect, and some have a beneficial effect. Now, what are some of the issues? And the beneficial, detrimental, and neutral or little effect. All of those are, once again, in regards to fitness. A detrimental mutation makes a creature less fit for its environment. A detrimental mutation actually can become a beneficial mutation if you move them to an environment in which that mutation is now useful. The ability to breathe air is not very useful for a deep sea creature, but if you move them onto land, it suddenly goes from a detrimental mutation to a beneficial mutation, right? Now, what are the issues with genetic entropy specifically? First of all, genetic entropy is trying to piggyback off of the scientific idea of error catastrophe. Genetic entropy is not science, it is pseudoscience, wrapped in science language, but it is trying to use the scientific idea of error catastrophe, which is similar. The big issue is, as you can see from this paper, academic.oup.com, failure of the theory challenges the quantitative basis of lethal mutagenesis and highlights the potential for adaptive evolution at high mutation rates. Also, John Sanford has been repeatedly shown to be inept or dishonest. He doesn't know what he's talking about, and this has been shown to him. Literally, one of the models that he uses in order to prove his genetic entropy is a computer program that was specifically designed to prove genetic entropy, not to check to see if genetic entropy is true. No. It was designed to prove genetic entropy. But error catastrophe has never been demonstrated in nature. There are quite a few papers discussing this. Error catastrophe is a theory that has not been demonstrated in nature despite plenty of testing. It turns out that even if you force generations to repeat over and over again, you go through lots of reading through lots of generations and you get mutation rates through all of them, it turns out populations don't just get so mutated that they cease to exist. Selection, natural selection, selects against those kinds of mutations, and the population continues. There is no evidence for genetic entropy. It is entirely theoretical, and in fact contradicts what evidence we actually have on the subject. For easy to understand resources, I have included a Reddit forum called Debate Evolution, or r/Debate Evolution. There are some pretty big name scientists, PhD students, those sorts of people on this particular thread, and specifically this thread has not just the answer to genetic entropy explained for a layman, but it also has a ton of links so you can go and look at the research for yourself. I could have put all of those here, but it would have taken up a lot more space. I just decided to provide you with the Reddit link so you could just click on it and go and see all of the resources. Why invent the wheel twice, right? And a YouTube video that I've included that very succinctly and very beautifully discusses what genetic entropy is and how the idea is flawed at its base. Again, if Hugh Owen is genuine in wanting to know the information, I have now provided all of the resources he could need to go and check that information. If he is only interested in my specific view, I have provided him all of the resources he needs to go and check the science so he can know what my view is, because my view is what the science demonstrates. And if his intentions are instead to present with me questions he thinks just can't be answered, here is an answer. In conclusion, number one, I want to reiterate, atheism does not depend on any of these. If nothing in science is correct about the origins of life, which would be quite an interesting discovery given how many scientists are working on it, how much evidence points to it. But if abiogenesis is just not true, it doesn't matter. Atheism doesn't depend on it. Atheism is simply a lack of belief in God. I am not looking at scientific data through an atheistic worldview. Neither were most of the scientists who made this stuff, right? It is not an atheistic worldview that brings these about. Instead, it is a methodological, naturalistic worldview where we go, okay, it seems like we have these things, so let's test and see if we actually have these things. Oh goodness, look, we do have these things. These things have these implications and these ramifications. Now that we know these things, let's go and experiment and test the ramifications of those things, right? Number two, genetic code can come from material processes. Number three, life can come from non-life. Number four, new functional biological information can come through genetic mutations. Number five, genetic entropy is entirely invalid pseudoscience. All of the resources you need for all of those are provided in my slideshow here. But let's get to my bonus conclusion. Number one, Google Scholar exists. If you are interested in any particular field of scholarly research, go to Google Scholar, look it up by keywords, find the papers on it, check to make sure that they are good papers, because you will sometimes find papers in journals that are less than reputable, but you have at your disposal the ability to do all of this research yourself. If you believe that, say, the world is only 6,000 to 10,000 years old, you can go and research and see what does the evidence say, right? You can go and see, okay, the claim here by current science is that the Earth is significantly older than that. How did they come to that conclusion? Was it just, oh, we're atheists and we have to explain the existence of the world today without God, so mustache-twirling villainous rant time to develop a counter to the creationist worldview? Or do they have data to support them? And if they have data, what is that data? How did they get that data? And are there any good refutations to that data? Right? If any topic comes up that seems to contradict your worldview, take the time to go and actually research it. Actually research it. What are the scholars who are experts on this, who spend their lives dedicated to this? What are they saying? And why are they saying it? Right? It is possible to be an expert and to be wrong. It is possible to spend your life on something and do it wrong. But at the very least, you'll be starting with an intelligent conversation, and with data and evidence you can go and check and confirm, and you can look at the discussion in the scholarly fields and the academic fields to see what the response to the specific claims are. Number two, similar, if you don't know where certain scientific ideas come from, don't just wave it off with some hand waving like this is just because of their atheist worldview. It's a fallacy. It is the genetic fallacy specifically to dismiss information because of its source, to dismiss an argument because of its source without actually evaluating the argument for itself. Even if you are convinced atheism is wrong, the old adage, even a broken clock is right twice a day, you still can't just dismiss the arguments that they're making. You must look at the actual content of the arguments, right? So do research what data they have, what experiments they've run, and what response other scientists have towards their work. Number three, the truth can stand up to scrutiny. If you believe that the Earth is 6,000 to 10,000 years old, that should be able to stand up to scrutiny. You should be able to find evidence to support it. More specifically, you shouldn't be able to find evidence that contradicts it. If what you believe is true, it can stand up to scrutiny. If what you believe cannot stand up to scrutiny, it's not true, right? The truth can stand up to scrutiny, so don't be afraid to scrutinize your worldview. Don't be afraid to question it. Don't be afraid to challenge it. If it's true, it'll hold up. If it's not true, it'll collapse. If it collapses, man, aren't you glad you are no longer chained and bound by a belief system that was not true? Number four, going to any topic with an answer already decided leaves you vulnerable to deception, right? Going to a topic having already decided that, well, obviously this must prove this, is a problem. If I'm trying to think of a good example. If I were to say that all people from Chicago must just be mean, right? I've seen statistically there's high crime rates in Chicago, therefore everybody in Chicago must be mean. And I go to Chicago deciding everybody there must be just awful people. And then I meet people who aren't awful, but I've already decided everyone from Chicago must be awful. I will reinterpret the evidence there and just go, oh, they must not actually be from here, right? Well, we'll just shift this around. Or I'll just ignore the interaction entirely. They must have actually been mean, and I just wasn't catching how. Right? If I approach the evidence going, well, clearly the world must be 6,000 to 10,000 years old, and then I start looking at the evidence. Any evidence that disproves the age of the Earth, I'm going to look at skeptically throughout. I'm going to be more open to the biased sources that are agreeing with my worldview, more open to echo chambers, and more open to deception, because I want my belief to be true. I've already decided it is. And so I will listen to anybody who comes along and says things that reaffirm what I already know to be true. That's not science, right? That's lunacy. That's insanity. That is utterly ridiculous. That is deciding ahead of time what you want to believe about the world and then deciding to reinterpret actual evidence so that it fits your decision about the world. First of all, that is putting yourself in the place of God. If we want to look at this from a Christian perspective, you're putting yourself in the place of, you've decided how the world must be. And if all of the evidence and logic and science and studies and research point to the contrary, well, they must be wrong because I know what's right. Because I am the omniscient one. And this leads into point number 5. Because if all of the evidence suggests that you're wrong, and you're building your worldview off of your interpretation of a piece of literature, either your interpretation of the literature is wrong, or maybe that literature doesn't actually know what it's talking about, right? If you are interpreting the literature correctly, and the literature, great example of this, that is non-controversial for Mr. Hugh Owen, the Quran states that sperm comes from, what is it? It's from, like, the back. It's not where sperm actually comes from, right? Well, if your interpretation of the Quran is that the Quran must be infallible in all that it says, well then, you come across that passage and you go, oh, okay, well then, even though we know that, we can demonstrate where it actually comes from, those demonstrations must be wrong. It must come from this other place. And in fact, maybe it comes from both, but we must cling to this and reject this atheistic science that says that no, it comes from the testes, right? We must reject this atheistic science. No. The way to approach all truth is to say that if this is actually true, then scrutiny should continue to prove it. And if I take off my worldview glasses, my biased glasses, and I look at this from an unbiased perspective, if I look at this strictly from a question of what is the evidence, what is the data, what does it suggest, regardless of whether it proves me right or wrong, and then it proves me right, then good. Maybe I was actually believing the truth, right? And if it proves me wrong, I ought to be ready to confess that. As a closing little story of this, I was researching the archaeology around the city of Jericho. The first archaeologist who was leading the charge in the archaeology of the city of Jericho dug down to the point where the story of Joshua discusses the city of Jericho. And the story in the book of Joshua, Jericho has these big walls, it's this big city, they have to march around it, and then the walls collapse, and then they're able to take the city. The archaeologist who was doing the dig was or leading the dig, he was a fundamentalist evangelical. He went into this dig 100% convinced the Bible was completely inerrant. Specifically, his interpretation of the Bible is completely inerrant. And that whenever the Bible says anything about history, science, any of that, it is completely 100% true, exactly as a clear reading of the text demonstrates. Then he dug up the city of Jericho, and he found the layer that corresponded with the time frame that the Israelites would have been coming through and would have conquered the city. And he found that it wasn't that there was no evidence, right? Because that's an argument from silence, and maybe you could say, well, sure, sometimes you don't find evidence. No. There was a lot of evidence. He found the city. The city had no walls. The city was not a main thoroughfare. The city was essentially a small village at that point. Now, there had been great cities there before and after, but at the time when the Israelites marched through, Jericho was not anything like what the Bible described it as. And you can see in his writings early on, he struggles to accept this, but eventually, the archaeologist leading this dig, eventually he comes around to the idea that, hey, if the evidence clearly disproves my position, and I want to be intellectually honest about the world and the way the world is, I need to admit that I don't understand what's going on and why Jericho is not what the Bible says it is. But the evidence is clear. Jericho is not what the Bible says it is. Right? He was confronted with data, with evidence, with information that disproved his worldview. And he had the humility to say, okay, then my worldview must be wrong because it does not conform with reality. That is what we should strive for. We should always be testing our worldview to see, are we believing the most true things and the fewest false things possible? Or are we like the multitudes of people that we look at and laugh? Because how could you possibly believe that with so much evidence to the contrary? Most people are convinced their worldview is correct. Most people throughout history have been wrong about that. So that leads me back to the question I asked towards the beginning. If everything in your worldview was wrong, how would you know? And maybe I can add a little follow-up. Are you clinging so tightly to your worldview that you would ignore all of the evidence that it was wrong so that your precious worldview might not have to change? Or are you allowing yourself to challenge your worldview with evidence, to challenge it with facts, and to change your worldview when necessary to make sure that you are conforming to reality? This has been my response to Hugh Owen. I look forward to picking up the debate series with him, discussing justice in the Old Testament. Until then, I look forward to whatever viewers I am able to get from this YouTube channel. Be on the lookout for more content coming out. It's been a pleasure, and have a good evening.